Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this IARC webinar on obesity and cancer. So as Sandrine said, I'm Dr. Mark Gunter and I'm head of the section of nutrition metabolism at IARC, and I'll be chairing the webinar. So we have two panelists, Professor Ed Giovannucci from the Harvard School of Public Health in the US, and Professor Annie Anderson from the University of Dundee in Scotland, who will both speak for about 20 minutes each. And then we'll have time for questions, so please add questions to the chat box. Next slide, Sandrine. So the two broad questions that we intend to address today during the webinar are outlined here. So firstly, what is the latest evidence to support a link between obesity and cancer, both in terms of the epidemiology, as well as in terms of mechanisms and experimental evidence? And then secondly, what are the possible solutions to address this problem with a particular view to cancer prevention strategies? Next slide. So just to provide some context, it's been estimated that almost 2 billion people now are living with overweight and obesity around the world. And we know the prevalence of overweight and obesity has been steadily rising in recent decades. So this is data from the NCD risk factor collaboration that was published a couple of years ago now, which looked at mean BMI among men and women in practically every country of the world in 1975 and 2014. So in the upper panel, you can see the mean BMI in every country in 1975 and in the lower panel in 2014. And the more red the shading indicates the higher the mean BMI in that country. So what you'll note is that essentially the obesity, the prevalence of obesity, the prevalence of high BMI has been increasing in practically every country. And you can see quite notable hotspots. So North Africa, the Middle East, United States, where we see the highest prevalence of obesity. But you can see even in countries where obesity was very low back in the 1970s, so parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, India, you can also see in those countries there's also been substantial increases in mean BMI in these regions. Next slide. This data, which comes from the same publication, shows the trends in mean BMI in different regions of the world. And what's quite striking is really some of the biggest increases in mean BMI are really seen in low to middle income countries. So in the second panel, where we see trends in Europe and high income English speaking countries, we see that there's been a very gentle increase in mean BMI over the last 30 or 40 years. But these countries already started at a relatively high point compared to the rest of the world in terms of their mean BMI. But what's interesting is if you look particularly at the top panel in Asia and Oceania, we've seen really quite striking increases in the prevalence of obesity in these regions. And this is also mirrored in parts of Africa and notably in the Middle East. So practically every part of the world is not escaping this increase in overweight and obesity and the obesity epidemic. Next slide. What's also troubling is that there's been an increase in obesity among children and adolescents. So this is data that was again published by the NCD risk factor collaboration last month in the Lancet, which looked at mean BMI among 19-year-olds and also BMI change between 1985 and 2019. So in the top panel, you can see mean BMI in 19-year-olds among girls on the left and boys on the right. And what you can see is that many countries in the world, so particularly in North America, parts of Latin America, Australia, North Africa, the mean BMI is already what would be deemed to be overweight, with, again, many other countries of the world seeing increases in mean BMI among younger individuals. And in the bottom panel, we can see that the change in BMI between 1985 and 2019, with some countries really experiencing very marked increases in their mean BMI among 19-year-olds. So for example, China, Mexico, and again, many countries in Africa and Latin America. So if obesity is a cause of many different types of cancer, then trends such as this could really signal a continued increase in obesity-related cancer in the decades to come, and may also be promoting cancers at a younger age. And I think we're already seeing an increase in cancers such as colorectal cancer among younger people, which may be driven by obesity. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Professor Ed Giovannucci, who is Professor of Nutrition and Epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. So Ed's been actively involved in studies on obesity, nutrition, and cancer for many years, and led many of the early studies from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-up Study on obesity and cancer. He's particularly interested in understanding the mechanisms linking obesity, nutrition, and cancer, and was one of the first to propose a link between insulin resistance and cancer, which is now recognized as an established mechanism linking obesity and several cancer sites. So Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction and the nice background. So I'm going to, in 20 minutes, present the broad evidence of linking obesity and cancer. Let's see. This report came out from the IARC. It was published in 2016 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it linked 13 cancers to obesity. And you can see the relative risks for the 13 malignancies. Not just IARC, the World Cancer Research Fund, American Institute of Cancer Research, also reviewed the evidence and came up essentially with the same list. These are 12 cancers. The only slight difference is the WCRF did not assess meningioma, but essentially the evidence was quite the same. This slide shows the relative risks for a 5 kilogram meter squared increase in BMI. And that's usually the unit that we use for BMI. And you can see a wide variation in relative risks. These are from meta-analyses. Now, the absolute numbers of cancers affected is affected by the magnitude of the relative risk and how common the cancer is overall in the population. So to show this, I just want to give one brief example. So we can see colorectal cancer and esophageal adenocarcinoma, where the relative risk is actually about 5 times higher for the esophagus than for colorectal cancer. So the association between obesity is much stronger for adenocarcinoma of the esophagus than it is for colorectal cancer. Colorectal cancer has multiple causes, so probably obesity is just one of the contributing causes. However, since colorectal cancer is so common, even that relatively modest relative risk is quite important in terms of the population attributable risk. So this slide summarizes the excess cancers due to obesity worldwide. And that this is actually due to excess body weight. So that's a body mass index of greater than 25. Notice a few things in this slide. So these pie charts obviously should add up to 100%. So in colorectal cancer, remember esophageal cancer had a much stronger relative risk, but among all the cancers, at least in men, attributable to being overweight or obese, 24% of colorectal and only 5% of esophageal cancer. So because colorectal cancer is much more common, even the more modest relative risk accounts for about 5 times the number of cases in men. Now, the other thing that's interesting is you look at the overall numbers, and for women, it's actually almost twice as many cancers attributable to overweight or obesity, about 370,000 versus 175,000 in men. And the reason is largely because, of course, most of the cancers, such as colorectal, are associated with obesity in both men and women. But women also have 2 important cancers, endometrial cancer and, of course, breast cancer, that are associated with obesity. And if you look at among the cancers associated with obesity, the excess cancers, in women, breast, about 70% are due to breast, endometrial, and colorectal cancer. In men, the big ones worldwide are liver, colorectal, and kidney cancer. Now, as Dr. Gunter mentioned, obesity rates have been going up worldwide. In the United States is one of the unfortunate leaders in that trend. And this analysis published by Hyuna Young and colleagues about a year ago showed a disturbing trend. Out of the 12 cancers associated with obesity, 9 of the 12 are increasing in young adults, and that's defined as individuals younger than 50 years old in the United States. So there's a nice overlap with a few exceptions. One notable exception is breast cancer. And the reason is likely that obesity is associated primarily with postmenopausal breast cancer. So it doesn't show up in the under 50 group. But this is certainly a disturbing trend showing that obesity is actually pushing the rates of cancer at the earlier ages, a broad spectrum of cancer. So how many cancers are attributable to obesity? This is a slide from the American Association for Cancer Research that put out a report about a couple of years ago. And if you add these all up, all the known causes of cancer, about 50% of cancers approximately are associated with known modifiable causes. And excess body weight shows up at about 8%. But that actually, I think, is probably an underestimate. And to understand that, it's important to look a little bit at smoking, which is, obviously smoking is the number one risk factor, accounting for about 20%. And these are for the United States. Now, smoking has a very, obviously has many effects. And one of them is either directly or through causing lung diseases. It really causes an increase in visceral fat, which I'll talk about shortly. It does have, it's associated sometimes with a positive or even a negative reduction in subcutaneous fat, and actually reduces lean body mass. So these actually complicate the situation. So in smokers, BMI is not a good indicator of adiposity and its associated metabolic aberrations. So, so BMI it's generally a good, though not perfect measure of adiposity, but not in smokers and also not in older people. So actually, in analyses that have excluded smokers, like we did one last year, having BMI above the normal range, so above 25 units, accounts for about 20% of cancers in the United States for both men and women. So if we go back to this slide that showed about 8% of cancers attributable to obesity, if you look in the population of non-smokers, it's actually 20% or perhaps even higher, as we'll see. So obesity or excess body weight is clearly an important risk factor for a large number of cancers. Now, an obvious question is, the evidence is really quite strong that obesity is associated with cancer, but it does intentional weight loss lower your risk of cancer. So in adulthood, let's say, I underline intentional because it's very hard to study weight loss in cancer because cancers often cause weight loss. So but we're not thinking about that right now. We're thinking about whether someone who doesn't have cancer yet, whether if they lose weight, they'll reduce their risk of cancer. And actually, I mean, the evidence isn't as overwhelming just in terms of the magnitude of studies as there is for just the link between obesity and cancer. But the evidence actually from various lines of evidence looking at pooled analyses of weight loss trials, studies of bariatric surgery where people have lost weight and then were followed and compared to a similar population that did not have surgery, and also observational data does suggest that weight loss reduces cancer risk, especially breast and endometrial cancer, which again are about 60% of the obesity attributable cancers in women. I won't show much data. I'll just show one study from the nurses' health study. This was a study of women not taking postmenopausal hormones greater than 50 years old. Actually, this was a pooled analysis of prospective data, so it's not just one study. And so the reference group here are the women who had a stable weight. And then when you look at women who had sustained weight loss of 2 to 4.5 kilograms, 4.5 to less than 9 or greater than 9 kilograms. So these were women who were probably, most of them were overweight or obese and then had lost weight and maintained this weight for a number of years. You see that there's a linear reduction in risk of breast cancer. So this and other data do suggest that losing weight intentionally, preferably through exercise and diet, will actually lower your risk of obesity-related cancers. So the epidemiology is quite strong, but it's important to buttress the epidemiology with mechanisms, knowledge of mechanisms. Our knowledge of mechanisms isn't as extensive as the observational data showing the associations, but I think it's very promising. There actually is quite a bit, and it's still on, research is ongoing. So this slide shows obesity here at the center, or adiposity, and then diet and physical activity, which obviously have direct effects on obesity and maybe indirect effects on various hormonal and pathophysiologic processes, including things like systemic inflammation. And there are probably even more, but I here show 4 general patterns, and I'll go through each one of these, some of them quickly, obviously, because of the time. First thing is some of the effect of obesity on cancer is pretty direct and limited to organs. So for example, obesity causes gallstones, which is a risk factor for gallbladder, main risk factor for gallbladder. It also causes reflux esophagitis, which is a main risk factor for adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. So these are very specific localized effect. Now, breast and endometrial we talked about before, and the main cause is that obesity is a cause of high estrogen levels in postmenopausal women. And there's a lot of data supporting this. I'll just show quickly. BMI with bioavailable estradiol, you can see 3 to 4-fold increase in estradiol, bioavailable estradiol, associated with BMI. And you see almost exactly the same pattern if you look at BMI and endometrial cancer. And endometrial cancer is strongly driven by estrogens. Now, for breast cancer, we also see an association between BMI is the same thing, but here I show waist circumference just for a little variety. If you look at women with low, medium, and high waist circumference, and then also stratify the women by whether they were taking hormones. So purple here, green are hormone users. So the hormone users are at higher risk of breast cancer compared to women with low BMI or low waist circumference, not taking hormones. And the waist circumference doesn't matter as much. This actually makes sense, physiologic sense if you think about it, because if women are taking exogenous hormones, that's going to be the main exposure, and that it's known to increase risk of breast cancer, and the body weight is less important. But if you exclude the hormone users and just look at the non-hormonal users, you see a nice association, linear, well, it's not nice, but it's at least from a statistical point, a linear association between waist circumference and breast cancer, postmenopausal breast cancer. And that's likely due to the estrogens. Now, Dr. Gunter mentioned insulin, and this is actually a little bit more complicated, but the simplified will focus on insulin and insulin-like growth factors, which are related to insulin physiologically, and systemic inflammation, which is a cause, obesity is a cause of systemic inflammation, which also causes insulin resistance. We believe these underlie multiple cancers, interestingly, including breast and endometrial. Now, we already learned that estrogens are important. I think estrogen are the main factors for breast and endometrial cancer, but there's evidence that insulin may also contribute to these. So these are multifactorial. But it's particularly the GI, gastrointestinal cancers, and kidney cancer that are associated with things like insulin and IGF. So what is the evidence for this? There's mechanistic evidence, insulin and IGF-1 are major systemic hormones that activate important signaling pathways which stimulate mitosis and inhibit apoptosis in many tissues. So there's a lot of basic science and mechanistic data supporting the role of insulin and IGF. In epidemiology, there are lots of studies that show these hormones are linked to various cancers. Now, if we assume insulin resistance is important for cancer, there is lots of evidence. It's also important to think of visceral fat and hepatic fat, fat in the liver. These are probably more directly relevant than the BMI. What's important is that these are a metabolically worse component of adiposity and actually represent a small percentage of total body weight. And these can actually be high. So visceral fat, the fat around the visceral organs, can be high even if BMI is in the normal range. And interestingly, this type of fat is very sensitive to physical activity and diet. This slide shows BMI, and you can see the visceral fat. And obviously, across a wide range of BMI, there's a strong association. But you actually see a lot of variation. So people like in a BMI of 25, which is considered borderline normal, there's a lot of overlap between people that have BMI of 30. So you can have a BMI of 25 and actually have more visceral fat than individuals with BMI of 30. Now, there's very little data that have directly examined visceral fat and cancer risk. There are some studies that have looked at visceral adiposity assessed by CT scan in relation to colorectal adenoma, which is a cancer precursor. And these studies show a strong linear association with adenoma risk, even in the normal BMI range. So this was a meta-analysis that we conducted a few years ago. Most of the individuals actually that had their visceral adiposity tissue measured were actually, these studies were done mainly in Korea, South Korea, and Japan. And the BMI, most of the individuals had BMI under 25, the average 23. So even in this low, nominally normal range of BMI, you see a nice association linear between visceral adiposity and colorectal adenoma, which again is a precursor to colon cancer. Now, what's particularly interesting, and this is a schematic slide showing, think of this as all the adipose in the body, and most of it is subcutaneous, and only about 10 to 15% is visceral and even hepatic liver fat. But this is the fat that drives inflammation and insulin resistance, and is a fat that's most susceptible to physical activity and diet. And there's lots of evidence that show this. I summarized all the studies some years ago. But I just pick one study here to show how important physical activity is. So this study started, this is pre-training and post-training individuals. And you can see the BMI 33.2, post-training, 12 weeks of exercise. The BMI didn't change much. It dropped 1 unit, 3% drop. But this study, they measured visceral fat that actually had a 22.4% drop, a much bigger drop. And there's studies that go on for like 6 months or a year, which see a modest weight loss, but up to about a 50% loss in visceral fat. And this study, even with very little weight loss, overall weight loss, showed a big reduction in insulin resistance. And this slide from the same study shows a strong correlation between the change in visceral fat and change in insulin resistance. And there are some people, and it's a relatively small study, and there's a wide variation in visceral fat, which may be explained by compliance or other factors. But in any case, some individuals had about a 50% reduction in visceral fat and a similar 50% reduction in insulin resistance. So why all this is important is that Moderate levels of physical activity, such as a daily brisk walk, hour or so, or 5 days a week, will not have a large effect on BMI, but it will have substantial effects on the amount of visceral adiposity, and then subsequently on inflammation and insulin. The physical activity is associated with lower risk of mostly the same cancers related to obesity. This was shown nicely in a pooled analysis done in 2016, which showed essentially all of the cancers associated with obesity are also associated with lack of physical activity. This is just quickly to show one study from a health professional study that I'm involved with, which shows that going up in aerobic physical activity is linearly associated with reduced risk of digestive system cancers. And this is about the range, just approximately. So you get the close to maximal benefit in the 150 to 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity, or 75 150 minutes per week of vigorous activity. So I'm close to ending here. I've talked mainly about cancer incidence, but there is some relevance for cancer survivorship. The data for lifestyle and survivors are limited for cancer-specific mortality, but factors such as obesity and physical activity are clearly important for overall mortality, especially for cancers with good prognosis, such as breast cancer, prostate cancer. So even if it's unclear as if there's a direct effect on cancer, generally for overall health, it's clearly obesity is important. Early evidence suggests potential benefits related to physical activity and dietary patterns in cancer survivors. The issue of weight loss in cancer patients is complex because losing weight may actually be a sign of the cancer progressing. So whether intentional weight loss benefits is less clear at this point. Perhaps some better imaging studies to look at visceral and lean mass rather than BMI are important. And that's my concluding slide, that excess adiposity is a major risk factor, accounting for at least 20% of cancers in non-smokers. Intentional weight loss, even in middle age, reduces cancer risk, particularly in women. The integrated effects of dietary pattern, physical activity, and adiposity on various biomarkers, particularly inflammation and growth-stimulating hormones like insulin, affect cancer risk, especially reproductive and digestive system cancers. Physical activity reduces visceral adiposity, which is a major source of inflammation and insulin resistance, even with modest weight loss. And emphasizing healthful dietary pattern and physical activity may be a useful public health approach rather than focusing solely on weight loss. Thank you for listening. And I think we're ready for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. It was really very nice presentation. So we're going to move on to our next panelist, who's Professor Annie Anderson. She's Professor of Public Health Nutrition at the University of Dundee in Scotland. She's trained originally in nutrition and clinical dietetics before moving into academic research. And her research is focused on theory-based behavioral nutrition and obesity interventions within the context of chronic disease risk reduction. And she has a special interest in cancer prevention and survivorship and is leading different trials within these areas. So the floor is yours, Annie.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this webinar. I'm at the University of Dundee, but I also run and co-direct the Scottish Cancer Prevention Network. And I really like people to share information about cancer prevention. So if you use social media, please feel free to tweet anything about today's talk on the SCPN. Now I just have to get my next slide to move on. So just bear with me. Doesn't want to move. Here we are. And this is a reminder that none of us can see what you're doing. So just dance like nobody's watching. Sedentary activity isn't good for our health. So I don't need you to sit and listen to this talk. Please move around as you wish. And what I want to do today is to summarize some of the key issues that were in my chapter in the World Cancer Report. So it's chapter 6.3, it's improving diet, nutrition, physical activity, and body weight. So there's a lot of things there, and we're going to focus on body weight, which of course reflects both diet and physical activity. Diet is complex because it isn't just about caloric intake, it's also about diet quality. And we're particularly focused in trying to promote a plant-based diet, but the one that is sustainable for the planet as well. And so there are many different dimensions when we think about diet, both in terms of cancer prevention and overall health. Now, I maintain that you can't outrun a bad diet. In the context of obesity, we know that caloric intake has a greater impact on energy expenditure, but as Ed's already highlighted, it is very important in terms of altering body composition, in particular visceral adiposity. But diet brings us many nutrients of relevance. And I'm going to do a lot of comparisons today between tobacco control and caloric control. But of course, people always say, oh, it's not the same because we've got to eat food. You don't need tobacco. It's not vital. But there are foods which we can describe as discretionary foods and drinks, which are low nutritional value and are not required for our health. So they're not essential parts of our diet. These are confectionery, cakes, biscuits, pastries, savoury snacks, crisps and sugary drinks. In Scotland, about 20% of all the calories and of all the fat we eat comes from these foods. 50% of the sugar comes from them. And for adults who drink alcohol, about 9% of our calories come from alcoholic drinks. So we can identify a bundle of foods that really ought to be consumed in very small quantities, if at all. And of course, alcohol is a carcinogen, as well as thinking about the caloric contributions. So these are the foods that we want to think about when we're thinking about controlling caloric intake. And there is no one route that we're going to deal and change with obesity. We're going to need a lot of different strategies, and we're really looking for equitable approaches that will impact on people from all social class backgrounds, from all ethnic backgrounds, and impact at the population to both reduce cancer recurrence and maybe even recurrence of cancer as well. And we need to take account of strategies that act at an individual level. That's what you and I choose to eat, but also population level. And whilst all of us, I'm sure, would support public health and policy approaches, we are going to wait a long time, and we have indeed waited a long time for those policies to take effect. And as we wait, it's not appropriate to stand back and watch the world getting heavier. We need to take action now, and we need to think of both individual and population level approaches. So what can we learn from tobacco control? This is my model of how over decades of action, we finally have been able to get the sort of controls that we know are relevant in smoking behaviour across the world. And we can say that the first action on tobacco control was very much at a programme level. That's down at the bottom. Campaigns making people aware of the risk between tobacco use and health, offering counselling and offering support. But as widespread awareness on these risks became known, we started to find that people wanted to move to health promoting society. Individuals, communities didn't want smoke affecting them. People working in bars didn't want smoke. And people were advocating using social marketing policies to say, let's change how we live. And once the population is on board saying, let's change, then it's much easier for the politicians to make the sort of policies that we need to impact in that behaviour. But politicians aren't going to make policies that are hugely unpopular with most of the populace because they'll lose their seats. So it's really important that we bring people with us in terms of getting the sort of legislation that we need. So I think this is very well described by the World Cancer Research Fund in their driving action framework. So down here at the bottom right, we have behavioural change communications. So this is about education, it's about offering counselling support, but really the much wider picture is offering health enhancing environments. So urban healthy design, marketing, fiscal policies, changing the settings that we live in, and then systems changes, integrating all these different parts of our lifestyles together with whether it's individuals, communities, workplaces, and so on, that we're basically working together rather than against each other. But, you know, talking about cancer and any risk behaviour is quite difficult because we have to contend with quite a lot of misinformation and people's views about what cancer is about. So here we have two very influential UK newspapers reminding us that actually it's about bad luck, not lifestyle, not genes. So people see this and they think, oh, I don't want to change my lifestyle. Why is it important? And then typically, I'm sure that we've all come across this sort of statement. This is from one of my studies, a woman attending breast screening on our Act Well programme. If you're going to get cancer, it's for you. It won't go by you. Lots of people overweight, drink, smoke, and they don't get cancer. So there is still a great need to be able to communicate well what we do know about the risks between lifestyle, including obesity and cancer. Now, our national agency, the Cancer Research UK, a couple of years ago launched this poster campaign flagging obesity as a cause of cancer. Many people found it interesting, thought-provoking, and it was very much designed for politicians to get this message clearly and simply. But I think what the agency failed to realise was the other side of that message, and that many people were offended by that. Obesity is very, very visible, and there's this sense of fat shaming, this sense of stigmatization, and we have to be very, very careful with our awareness campaigns, because if we lose public support, we will lose that chain of getting people on board. Writing in the BMJ, Margaret McCartney, a GP, also flags what effect will this campaign have on people who have a diagnosis of cancer and obese? Will they feel guilty? Will they feel shame? Does this campaign do more harm than good? And it's very difficult. We need to raise awareness. So basically that slide was saying we really need, if we're going to raise awareness, we need to offer support as well. I do fundamentally think that awareness and education is very important to provide knowledge and skills, to influence cultural behaviour, and to generate healthy public support. But I don't think awareness and education alone is enough, because we need to try and help create that new environment, support healthy environments in our workplaces and communities. And we need champions to be able to do that. Health professions are a very good example of how we can get support around these issues like obesity and cancer. And I mentioned earlier the Scottish Cancer Prevention Network, which is our advocacy agency in Scotland, to talk about the risk factors, but what we can do about them in our everyday lives, as well as influencing our policymakers. And this is just an example of the sorts of environments that we've probably all faced in everyday life. We get food and drink in all settings of our life. Workplace, biscuits. We even go into charity shops and there's sweets and chocolates available for children to help themselves. These pictures of sweets here, I took at a national cancer conference. The stalls from various laboratory makers all offer free enticements for people to come to their stalls. We go to the cinema for buckets of popcorn. We can still eat in public transport. In every setting, including thank you gifts, we give huge amounts of calories. Is that the environment that we really want? And for any of you who are from NGOs and have to fundraise, how often do we use bake sales for fundraising? It's about setting the environment, and there are things that we can do as well as trying to influence our policy. Advocacy is important. A very good paper in The Lancet a few years back about the mobilization of public support for policy action. And increasing public demand is something that we can help contribute towards. And in the UK, we have a very strong advocate, not in the form of a public health physician, but our television chef, who's managed to persuade our government to introduce a sugary drinks tax. So we can do it and we can have an impact. But it's really, we need to get to health enhancing environments with the potential for greatest reach and equitable impacts. And impacts where the consumer is what is normal is healthy, and they don't have to make special efforts to make a difference. Again, the World Cancer Research Fund have a very good database of examples of health enhancing environments, including examples of labeling from Mexico, some new legislation about to come in, improving food supply, good examples of Brazil's food purchasing, incentives in community, healthy vending machines. Across the world, policies are being implemented to help create healthy environments. And I think we have a lot to learn from this international work towards moving people to less obesogenic environments. But in terms of policy, what are the issues? And again, looking at tobacco control, this is a slide borrowed from Cancer Research UK, clearly depicts how smoking has decreased in the UK. In fact, it's more than halved between 1974 and 2015. And how has that come about? Not just awareness and education, but limits on marketing, pricing, and availability. And these are the three important actions that can influence tobacco control and have the potential to influence the control over our excess caloric intake. In terms of marketing, this image is one I took in a supermarket a couple of Decembers back, walked in. It must have been about the beginning of December, saw all these things in offer, got my trolley out and started to fill various things in. My husband said, we never buy these things. Why are you putting them in the trolley? Oh, because I'm preparing. But you just get totally sucked in. You don't even notice what you're starting to put in your trolley. The graph depicts data from Scotland. The green bars are the proportion of retail purchase for foods we may wish people to eat more of, and the red ones are foods we wish people to eat less of. And it's 50% more on foods that we'd like people to eat less of. We need to change that balance to at least a level playing field. And at the moment, the UK is looking at introducing restriction on total online advertising for these foods at high fat, sugar and salt. And that's the road I think we're going to need to go down to get equitable approaches. Coming from Scotland, I have to say something about pricing, because we were the first country in the world to introduce minimum unit pricing, selling a limit of 50 pence per unit of alcohol. And within the first year after that was implemented in 2018, we saw a reduction in weekly purchase of alcohol, with a greatest impact on lower income households, with no increase in household expenditure. So it wasn't that people were paying more, they were actually drinking less. And there are many examples of demonstrating that pricing works. Another question that people ask is, in terms of policy, do we really need legislative mandatory policy, or can we get voluntary action? I think we have a very good illustration here in terms of trying to reduce sugar. Now, sugar contributes to obesity in childhood and to some extent in adults, and particularly sugary drinks. So in England, there's a desire to reduce sugar intake by 20% by the end of this year. Now, the latest update for 2019 has shown with voluntary reductions, we've had a 3% decrease in sugar intake. And in fact, for some odd reason, sugar in confectionery, chocolate confectionery seems to have gone up. But when we look at the mandatory legislation in the form of the soft drinks industry level, we've got a huge reduction in total sugar, and that's across all socioeconomic groups, and it's contributed to reduction in calories as well. So I think there's little doubt that if we want effective action, then we don't do it through voluntary. I'm sorry, I've shown this slide already, but it's just to make the point that we do also need to tackle the availability of foods, and we need to look hard to see what kind of policy restrictions there might be there. And I'm just going to wind up with some individual level approaches to obesity. A good deal of my work is around trying to to provide opportunities and to help capability and motivation for people to change their diet when they're thinking about cancer. And in that context, I'm interested in cancer screening programs. Some years ago, we did a weight loss and lifestyle trial for people who were overweight, who'd been diagnosed with colorectal adenomas after taking part in a bowel screening, the National Bowel Screening Programme. If you look on the right side of the slide, we delivered it in home settings, offering individuals one-to-one counselling with 3 face-to-face visits and monthly calls, personalised energy prescriptions, free body weight scales. It's amazing the number of people who can't weigh themselves. We use a number of behavioural change techniques. I'm very keen on incorporating motivational interviewing, goal setting, self-monitoring, use of pedometers. And over a 12-month period, we had a very good retention for our participants, a weight loss of 3.5 kilograms with significant reduction in other parameters of interest for chronic disease. And we recruited 74% men, which reflects, of course, colorectal adenomas, but men aged 63.6 years. It isn't too late to change diet and physical activity well into retirement. We're just finishing off another trial in the breast screening setting, which was funded as part of the Scottish Government's cancer plan. And in this trial, which is called the Act Well trial, we used a community assets approach. So existing screening clinics, women coming through routine mammography were asked if they'd like to take part in a lifestyle intervention. We trained up volunteers to deliver a weight loss program in partnership with the charity Breast Cancer Now. And we brought women into leisure centres to speak to them face-to-face for counselling. We gave them a walking programme based on a pedometer, but within the leisure centre, they could see what facilities were available. And our main outcomes of interest is body weight and physical activity. And I hope to see this, the results of this published quite soon. Just one other aspect about screening context is slightly different, which is people at higher genetic risk. Again, we've done some work in this setting, offering people with a higher risk of bowel and breast cancer the chance to take part in a weight loss program. It's all published, but the thing I'd like to flag here is that about 20% of people who were coming through and should have been offered the program were not told about it. And it's because staff said they thought, it wouldn't be appropriate. There's a genetic risk, people, they may be ineligible, they're not suitable, might create poor patient response. And they were skeptical about the benefits of lifestyle. So we have work to do with engaging our health service community about weight reduction. So I'm going to wind up, and my conclusions are that there are ways to change obesity-related behaviours, principally excess caloric intake, that have much to learn from tobacco control. Garnering public support, advocacy and co-creation of health supporting environments are fundamental for equitable policy action, but individual programmes should not be ignored and can help to gain support for widespread change. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That was excellent. So we have about 10-15 minutes for some discussion, and there's been quite a few questions put in the chat. So perhaps I'll read these out and then we can do our best to answer them. So the first one was actually a question that was sent ahead of time from Kay McGee in the US. And this person asked, it is very helpful to understand the relationship of obesity and prevalence of cancer. However, which obesity prevention and treatment approaches appear to work for cancer patients? Do we have some best practices to share? Improving knowledge and skills about the how as well as the what will be essential if we hope to reduce cancer. Thank you. So I guess, Ed, you touched a bit upon this. So essentially we're asking, what advice can we give to cancer patients around maintaining a healthy weight, given there's lots of complexities in that regard?
Yeah, no, it's certainly important. As I mentioned in my talk, there's less direct evidence regarding body weight and cancer progression in survivors. I mean, if cancer is complicated, because once people have cancer, like some may have already, progressing advanced cancer, and some are having treatments. So it's hard to make a one size fits all kind of statement. I mean, certainly, I think for people who are relatively stable or like over their treatment and are relatively healthy, and the cancer is at least not obviously progressing. The diet and what Dr. Anderson talked about, the diet and physical activity are clearly important. The direct question on losing body weight, like if that will be beneficial for cancer, is less cancer progression is less clear at this point, and there haven't been as many studies. But on balance, it does seem that obesity certainly does cause progression of some cancers, probably breast and colorectal. So it's, I think the best that we can say is if the person isn't healthy enough to withstand intentional weight loss, then probably there will be some benefits, but it has to be combined with physical activity and diet. Yep. Maybe Dr. Anderson has other points to make or not.
Yeah, I think this is a great research area. We've much to find out. But now, as we see more people being diagnosed early, coming through the treatment pathways and essentially clear, then we need to remember that many people who've had a diagnosis of cancer, their final cause of death will in fact be cardiovascular disease. So we need to think of overall health as well. So I think that's terribly important. I think probably the best evidence there is in relation to intentional weight loss in cancer survivors is for breast cancer patients, thinking of the WIN study. And I think that's an area that we need to pursue further. I think the issue here is that what we would like to see in cancer survivors is optimizing body composition. So we've got improvements in lean body mass, so we're building muscle through physical activity, but at the same time decreasing fat, particularly visceral fat, through watching total fat by caloric amount. And so I think there would be a lot of merit for that, for having body composition as the end point for people, and that combination of physical activity.
Yeah, this is definitely an area where there's a lot more research needed. So next question, they're coming in quite thick and fast now, so I'll have to try and get through them. So the next question from the US, Wei Bao, University of Iowa, asked how important is the role of the gut microbiota in the link between obesity and cancer? If Ed, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I would say it's at this point it's mainly a research area. There's no compelling evidence, and maybe Mark or Annie would want it, but I'm not aware of compelling evidence that it's important. But they haven't, the technology is really only like a few years old, and like in some of like our cohorts, we just have started. We're still collecting samples on tens of thousands of people, and so I think hopefully in the next 5 years, maybe that's optimistic, we'll have some better answers. But it's a very promising area, but it's black box at this point.
I mean, I guess we know the gut microbiota are dysregulated in obesity, and they may also play a role in insulin sensitivity. So hypothetically, their activity could play a link between obesity and cancer, but whether it's direct or whether it's through some of these other established mechanisms, I guess is, another area that we need a lot more research.
Definitely.
Question from John Nascari. So obesity is biologically stamped in diet and exercise. So can obesity be cured? maybe Annie, I don't know if you want to tackle that one.
Okay, so racking my brain there. First of all, yeah, so I might think of something very extreme like bariatric surgery. But one of the interesting things we know from the cohorts of people who've had bariatric surgery is that their incidence of cancer is reduced. So whatever the relationship between obesity and cancer has been, and cancer development has been, it isn't imprinted forever. It does look like you can actually do something about it. And I think there's some interesting learning from that. But if you look at more conventional ways to lose weight, I think one of the problems that we've not been good at is maintaining the weight that when we lose weight, maintaining weight loss. So we've seen some really good trials of late with using liquid formula diets to lose quite significant amounts of weight. And I'm thinking of the direct trial for diabetes. But what we've not really done after that is brought in the behavioral support skills that are needed for people to then maintain that weight loss. And that's, I think, an area, a behavioral science area that is really being developed at the moment. And it's when that is done that we're going to be able to answer your question.
Yeah, good answer. We have a question from Sivarajan in Malaysia. Is there any difference in the prevalence of cancer in between obesity due to genetic factors compared to obesity due to unhealthy lifestyles? If Ed, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There are studies that called Mendelian randomization studies that focus on the genetic determinants of obesity, and they fairly consistently show associations with the obesity-related cancers. It's a little bit of complexity with breast cancer, but in general, they're very consistent. And so, right, whether we look at obesity that's related probably more to lifestyle and probably that's more genetically driven, and of course the two interact, they're both are associated with obesity-related cancers. That's pretty clear right now.
Yeah.
Mark, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, the Mendelian randomization studies are really quite robust now for many of the cancers. So, next question from Helena Bergussia, very complicated Swedish name, who asks, I think we need to come up with solutions, not to tell people about what they do wrong and risks, but speak about what they are doing right and what they can do better instead. Annie, if you want to address that.
So there's 2 points about that question that come to my mind. Is that I wish we didn't have to tell people to do anything. I wish we lived in an environment where the choices that we had are healthy choices. They're not, they're the norm. And I think that's part of the problem. But, you know, for a long time, work in diet and cancer was very focused on increasing fruits and vegetables. And there was a very strong field that we should tell people what they should eat. So have more fiber and more fruits and vegetables. And that remains important. But I think that we did that to the detriment of actually getting to grips with what now looks to be a much bigger issue, which is the excess caloric intake as a cause of cancer. And so I don't think we can hide the data that we've got, very uncomfortable though it is. And I think we have to try and work together to make the changes in our communities and societies so that the norm is the healthier.
So the next 2 questions, Ed, you've already answered them. There are specific questions about your data. Then we have a question from Jeffrey Solomon, who, to Annie, how many people were in your trial? I'm not sure which one he's referring to, but
the Be Well trial. Oh, I'm just trying to think. It's something like 380. I can't remember the figure offhand. And the Act Well trial is 560.
Okay. Carlin McGee, what can be done to more effectively address the impact of stress worldwide and locally to reduce its impact on eating as well as cancer? Stress and addictive behaviors and depression appear to contribute unhealthy behaviors and increase cancer risk.
I wish I knew the answer to that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've living through this time of COVID, we've all experienced the most incredible stress in our life. And many of us, of course, have turned to extra eating or drinking and so on. And many of us have also opened the door, if you like, on mindfulness and a whole range of techniques to try and cope with what has been thrown at us. And again, I wish I knew the answer to how we can deal with that. We live in a very stressful society, but I feel it's a much broader and wider societal problem.
Yeah, research on stress and obesity and cancer is quite difficult to do because it's
difficult to know which metrics to measure.
Question from Jana Pitkanemi from Finland. Follow-up for increasing early onset colorectal cancer. What is known about risk factors for early onset colorectal cancers, as most of them are sporadic in terms of inherited genetics? Ed?
Yeah, the risk factors, I mean, we're just beginning to learn about early onset colorectal cancer. Those are cancers defined as before age of 50. And like, I don't think we have a clear answer of what's really driving the increase that's seen in some, not all countries, but in the US, for example, there is a notable increase. But we do see a lot of the same risk factors, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, do contribute to those. That we just published, in fact, I'm not sure it's published yet, but it should be coming out soon, that looking at dietary patterns and quote, bad dietary patterns do seem to contribute to early onset, at least adenomas. We presume it'll be the same for colorectal cancers. So I think some of it is driven by the same lifestyle factors that we think is important for colon cancer. If there's another factor, like, that we don't have established yet, related perhaps to the microbiome, things like, use of antibiotics, those may turn out to be important, but we don't know yet at this point. But at least we can say that a lot of the same risk factors, particularly obesity, sedentary lifestyle, do show up as risk factors for early onset.
I guess many of the people developing early onset colorectal cancer were those born in the 70s and 80s now, where probably a lot of diets, ultra processed foods and kind of more higher calorie foods were becoming much more commonplace in many countries back in the 70s and 80s. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We started to look at things like diets in high school or adolescence, and they do initial results, it still needs to be confirmed, do show that they're important. So a lot of the high sugar intakes, things like that, are contributing.
Yeah. Okay. Question from Robert O'Connor from the Irish Cancer Society, for Annie. Have you any thoughts on how best to educate healthcare professionals? Undergraduate education might be best, but longest for return.
Yeah, I think obviously this needs to be done within their own professional grouping and recognised and certified. We've done some work looking at the undergraduate curriculum of nurses, in which there's virtually nothing on lifestyle in this country. But it needs to be valued, it needs to be examined, because we all know at undergraduate level, unless it's examined, it doesn't matter, but it's at postgraduate level, it's going to be really important. I also think that education, that training needs to include, with respect to obesity, understanding about sensitivity and avoiding stigma as well, because we now see many doctors saying that they're not going to talk about obesity because they're scared it will spoil their patient relationship. So it needs to be a fairly broad-ranging type of training.
Yeah. And we have a question from Ashinaga from Japan. Thank you for the nice talk. How about childhood obesity and cancer risk? I guess this is difficult to study properly, but.
Yeah, childhood obesity, contributes. Probably for some cancers, it directly contributes, and then it also contributes to being obese later in life. If you start early, it's going to be more likely, at least. I mean, some people can reduce their weight, but population-wise, there'll be greater adult obesity. So it does have that probably direct effects for some cancers and indirect effects. We did look at data, like, for example, in Nurses' Health Study, childhood obesity was a very strong risk factor for colon cancer in women, less so in men for some reason, but for women, it was quite a strong risk factor. So I think childhood obesity is definitely important. And as I showed in one of the slides, that doesn't prove cause and effect, but the cancers under the age of 50, 9 out of the 12 obesity-related cancers have been increasing in the United States in parallel with the increase in childhood obesity. So it doesn't prove cause and effect, but it is pretty strong circumstantial evidence.
Yep. Got 3 or 4 more questions. I know we're a bit over time, but let's try and get through them. So Jana from Finland, another question for Annie. How stable or permanent are changes in weight loss in the interventions included in the screening program visits?
Okay, so we ran these studies as 12-month follow-ups, so we don't have any long-term data, but I'd love funding for long-term data, and we have permission to recontact. So particularly for Actual, the one we've just finished, we'd very much like to do that. But I should say that what we did in our intervention, it was over a year, and we set a weight loss goal of 7% of body weight loss. And if they achieved that, we then taught them about weight loss maintenance and avoidance of weight gain. Some people wanted to continue to lose more weight, and we thought it was more important to have a weight stable period. So I'd like to think that we've introduced those concepts as well as weight loss learning.
Thanks. And then a question from Philippa Lucas Correa. Thank you for the brilliant interventions. I have a question for Professor Giovannucci. What is your opinion on the cutoffs of VAT values in CT scans?
Well, it's a good question. The slide that I showed in other data for other endpoints, it is interesting that most of the associations are very linear, starting from the lowest, to the highest categories. So I think in terms of cutoffs, to my knowledge, there aren't well-established cutoffs for VAT, visceral adiposity, that I used clinically. And I think it'll turn out to be similar to, for example, blood pressure and heart disease, cholesterol and heart disease, that the association is fairly linear. And so that the cut point, there's no magic cut point. It's just going to be practical. To get as low as possible will maximize lowering your risk or minimize your risk. Now, what's practical is a different story.
Yep.
But yeah, I think it's a good question, though.
Yep. Then we have a question from Mexico. Thank you for the nice talk. What do you think about obesity is related to breast cancer risk in postmenopausal women, but is not a risk factor in premenopausal women? So this is a really interesting research question that many of us have been working on for decades.
Do you want to answer that, Mark?
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's obesity for breast cancer is a bit complicated because early life obesity, probably around age 10, it may have something to do with puberty. It does actually seem protective for breast cancer, particularly premenopausal breast cancer. So that is curious. I mean, certainly obesity in adulthood, it increases risk of breast cancer. So the overall impact of obesity is increasing risk for breast cancer, particularly postmenopausal breast cancer. But for premenopausal breast cancer, it's less clear. However, there is some evidence that even though there is this suggestive protective association for incidence, the cancers, there's a higher mortality from obese women, even premenopausal, that do get breast cancer. They have a significantly higher mortality rate from the cancer. So even for premenopausal obesity, the balance is not clear yet on whether obesity overall is positive or negative. Having said that, clearly for overall health, obesity is deleterious, but there is this interesting inverse association for premenopausal breast cancer.
I think there is data on weight gain in the premenopausal period increases risk of breast cancer.
That's correct. Yeah. So it's probably very early life obesity that has a protective association,
which is
not a
consistent
practical answer.
Data as well.
I wonder if I could just add something here. It's just thinking about women that I talk to who say, "Oh, that lifestyle, it seems to be obesity is okay for premenopausal, but not postmenopausal." It's probably important to remember that physical activity appears to be protective in both pre and post, and alcohol in pre and post seems to increase risk. So there's the evidence around lifestyle and breast cancer is quite high, and of course lactation is beneficial for both too.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, running out of time, but I'm going to quickly try and get through the remaining questions. So from Anna Mayan at IARC, are you aware of successful interventions on how to tackle obesity in the low to middle income countries where the prevalence is high, including Latin America and Middle Eastern countries, especially in women?
I'm not aware of that data at all. I would look to WCRF, who've got a very good international database. I'd be tempted to look at places like Chile, who've been very innovative in terms of their policy, and I think that's a very good question indeed.
I think of Mexico as well. I mean, I know that they brought in the sugary drinks tax quite early on because they got very high rates of obesity. But, whether that's had a major impact, I'm not sure.
It's certainly shown to have an impact. I'm not sure, how far that's gone at all. And I think it was principally directed at childhood, but then moving toward which will impact on all population.
Yeah. And then for Ed, what are your thoughts on the relationship between obesity, infection, and risk of stomach non-cardia cancer? From Steph in the UK.
Yeah, obesity has been shown pretty clearly to increase risk of cardiac cancers of the cardia, but it's been less clear for the non-cardiac cancers that are probably more related to H. pylori infection. I can't say for sure that there is an association, but it's certainly clear for cardiac cancer and unclear at this point for the other non-cardiac cancers.
Yeah. Okay, two last questions from Samuel Das. What about the use of liraglutide for weight loss and endometrial carcinoma?
I don't know. I don't know much about that. I mean, I would say weight loss in general would almost definitely lower risk of endometrial carcinoma, but I'm not sure specifically for this.
Yeah, I think we lack good data on the impact of weight loss and endometrial cancer. Actually, any trials that have been done have not looked hugely effective at all.
Yeah. And then Ashinaga from Japan is asking, do we understand the mechanisms that link visceral fat to cancer?
Well, yeah, I mean, visceral fat is associated with multiple factors, particularly it increases systemic inflammation, which then causes an increase in insulin resistance and higher levels of insulin, which we think is probably the underlying cause. Now, and Mark can speak well about this, that when you have metabolic abnormalities, there are a lot of specific molecules or compounds that are affected, leptin, adiponectin. So the way I think of insulin resistance, it may or may not necessarily be insulin is the causal molecule, but I think of it more as a pathway. So there are lots of metabolic abnormalities that are associated with visceral adiposity. To say which is the specific causal factor for cancer, it's probably not clear at this point. Maybe Mendelian randomization studies can help because so many things change, and probably you know, even perhaps more than one may be causative factors. I don't know, Mark, if you would like to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the evidence for insulin is quite convincing at this point, both from experimental studies plus epidemiology and also the Mendelian randomization studies, which are showing quite robust associations. But yeah, I mean, there probably are other interrelated factors, some of which we might not even discovered yet. I mean, this is where some of the new technologies could also be helpful, like metabolomics or proteomics, which could maybe probe pathways which we haven't really studied previously. Because I mean, yeah, we know that visceral fat has all sorts of metabolic consequences. I mean, the gut microbiota as well. I mean, there's some evidence there that there could be an impact on or bidirectional relationship between inflammation and visceral fat and the microbiome. So yeah, this is another area where more research is needed. Very quickly, Amanda Jones, very interesting, giving us lots to reflect on. Annie talked about the stigma surrounding healthcare professionals talking to us about our weight. How do we overcome this stigma as a society? That's a big question.
It is a big question. Obesity Health Alliance in the UK have, suggested a wide number of things that we need to be aware of, how we depict people with obesity and be using first-person language. So it's not obese people, it's people with obesity. And I think there's a lot of guidance that they have produced. Produced a paper on stigmatization and its relationship with various health outcomes in the new year. And that's one to watch out for.
Yeah. Okay, so we've come to the end of the questions. Maybe just one that I want to leave us with, and I'll ask you both. So obviously, the obvious solution to impacting the obesity cancer link is to reduce obesity in society. And obviously there are different ways of doing that, and Annie, you've touched upon many of them. In my pessimistic mode, if we can't achieve these big changes in obesity at population level, what do we do about the cancer burden, which is sort of clearly increasing due to obesity? I mean, do you think we should have targeted interventions for people who might be at high risk of cancer that maybe impact some of these biological pathways linked to obesity, like insulin resistance or inflammation? I mean, this is a question that people have asked me. What do we do about the obesity cancer link if we can't get people to lose weight? Any thoughts? I mean, it's a difficult question, but I think it's one that we need to have.
Okay, so I think that we've turned all our lives to pharmacological approaches. We've not done well on pharmacological approaches to obesity. We've not done well on pharmacological approaches to cancer prevention. Our chemopreventive agents, as they, from what they are, have numerous side effects. I don't think we can sidestep dealing with the obesity issue. I think there's no way around it.
Ed?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think physical activity and diet pattern is a part of the solution. I think it's also important to note that that's why I talked quite a bit about visceral adiposity, is that even in the normal BMI range, and we think obesity, we think, okay, people with BMI is greater than 30, but we have a lot of the same pathophysiology going on that's probably related to poor diet and lack of physical activity. Visceral fat can accumulate, like even smoking, probably that's one of the mechanisms of smoking is accumulation of visceral fat. So I think it's even like people may not need to lose weight, but may need to improve their body composition. That's probably a big component of cancer risk. So I think at least starting to think about ways to increase physical activity, reduce sedentary lifestyle, and improve dietary pattern is complementary to weight loss.
Yeah, I mean, in our studies, around 20% of people who are lean have hyperinsulinemia.
Right.
So there are people walking around who aren't kind of classically obese as categorized by BMI, but metabolically they are and would be at increased risk of cancer. So we need to find a way of capturing these people. And likewise, I mean, I know there's a lot of kind of controversy around healthy obesity, but it does seem to be there is a phenotype of obesity where they don't seem to have such severe metabolic abnormalities. But I know.
Sure, but that is not the majority.
No,
and I think
it's a small
from a research perspective, that's hugely interesting, and we want to explore that for learning more. But let's not forget the majority problem.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we're 20 minutes over, and thank you so much for staying. I think it was really great questions and really great discussion.